Imagine this. A lonely retiree buys an abandoned storage unit for just $50. But when he lifts the door, there's no furniture, no boxes, only a massive wall of sand. What he uncovers beneath it will change his life and make the past come looking for him. Watch till the end, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in his place. And if you're new here, subscribe, because more unbelievable stories are coming. Walter Briggs had grown used to mornings that felt exactly like the ones before them. Quiet, predictable, wrapped in the slow rhythm of retirement he never learned to love. At 68, his days drifted between early coffee, long walks around the lake, and silent evenings in a rental home that felt more like a waiting room than a life. He missed the purpose his badge once gave him. He missed waking up knowing someone needed him. Now the world moved on without him, leaving only routine and the soft echo of years spent chasing crimes, solving puzzles, and reading people better than they could read themselves. That morning, as he drove to Westline Self-Storage, he expected nothing more than dust, old boxes, and the faint smell of metal and stale air. He visited the storage unit out of habit, an excuse to get out of the house and handle the leftover artifacts of his former life. Case files no one wanted, tools he no longer used, gear too nostalgic to throw away. But when he turned into the lot, he noticed more cars than usual, more voices, more movement. A crowd had gathered near the entrance, buzzing with anticipation. A live storage auction. Walter almost turned around. He wasn't here for games or treasure hunts. He was here for his old things. But as he walked past the crowd, the auctioneer called out, "Sir, you here for the sale? We're starting in 5 minutes." He tried to wave him off, but nearby bidders talked loudly about last week's Unit 1, filled with vintage military patches worth thousands. Another bragged about a hidden safe stuffed with old jewelry. Walter wasn't a man who believed in luck, but something tugged at him. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe the old instinct that woke up at the scent of mystery. Something in him leaned forward, listening. He unlocked his own unit, rummaged through dusty cardboard boxes, and sat for a moment on a folding chair he kept in the corner. Sunlight crept under the door, cutting across a stack of faded case files. His phone vibrated with a notification he had no reason to receive. Local storage auction starting now. He hadn't searched for that, hadn't spoken about it. Yet the timing felt so precise, he couldn't help but laugh quietly. "All right, Margaret," he murmured, imagining his late ex-wife smirking at him from somewhere. "If this is a sign, I see it." When he stepped back into the sunlight, the auction was beginning. He lingered at the back, not intending to bid. The first units were the usual disappointment-broken furniture, children's toys, tangled electronics. But the people around him leaned in, hunting for meaning in every shadow. Walter watched them with a quiet fascination. It reminded him of detectives scanning a crime scene, each person hoping to find something everyone else missed. Then the auctioneer stopped at Unit B7. "This one's odd," he announced, tapping the metal door. "Tenant vanished 7 months ago. Came once at night, hauled in something massive, spent hours drilling and hammering." He flipped a page. "Hasn't been back since." People joked nervously. "What did he bury in there?" "His mother-in-law." "A meth lab." The auctioneer shrugged. "We have no idea. Could be trash, could be treasure." Starting bid, 50. The door rolled up with a rattling groan, and the crowd froze. Inside the unit stood a towering wall of sand. Actual sand, compacted and shaped like someone had poured it in by the truckload. It filled nearly the entire space from floor to ceiling, perfectly leveled but disturbingly unnatural. Groans and laughter broke out. "Who wants to dig through that?" "No thanks." "Hard pass." People drifted away almost immediately. To them, it was worthless, But Walter felt something electric hum beneath his ribs. The sand wasn't random. It wasn't sloppy. It was deliberate, intentional. His instincts whispered the same thing they once did inside taped-off motel rooms and abandoned garages. Someone hid something. Someone didn't want it found. That whisper grew stronger, compelling him forward. Almost without thinking, his hand rose. 50, he said. Heads turned. Someone smirked. No one countered. Within seconds, the auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold. Unit B7 goes to the gentleman in the back. The crowd dispersed, forgetting the oddity immediately. But Walter remained rooted, staring at the closed door as though it were a sealed chapter waiting for the right reader. Hours later, he returned with gloves, a small shovel, and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The corridor was empty, eerily still. He lifted the door again, revealing the silent golden wall of sand. As he stepped closer, the air felt heavier, as if whatever lay beneath that sand pressed up against him from below. He crouched, dragging his fingers across the surface. It wasn't loose or gritty. It was cold, dense, packed with a deliberate firmness that spoke of time, weight, intention. This wasn't a spill. This wasn't negligence. Someone had engineered this. Walter stood, scanning the edges of the unit with the trained eye he once relied on to decipher the smallest clues. Scratches on the concrete where something heavy had been dragged. Faint scuffs on the wall, at climbing height. A subtle indentation near the back, barely a shadow of something rectangular buried underneath. Each detail whispered, "Keep digging." He widened the first small trench, testing how the sand shifted. It didn't. Every shovelful felt like lifting stone, each scoop heavier than the last. His shoulders burned, sweat rolled down his back, and yet, the more resistance he felt, the more certain he became. The harder something is to hide, the more important it is to someone. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Sand scraped against metal, metal against concrete. Then, clang. His shovel struck something solid. Heart thudding, Walter dropped to his knees and brushed away sand with his bare hands until a wooden corner emerged, a crate, old and reinforced, buried deep. It wouldn't budge. Whatever lay beneath was heavier still. He marked the spot and continued. Soon he uncovered a metal cylinder wrapped in industrial tape, empty but oddly crafted, with grooves inside where something once fit snugly. Then a glass display case, carefully sealed, containing old foreign coins, badges, a pocket watch, and a ribbon with a pin. This wasn't trash. This was curated, hidden, buried. 2 employees wandered over, murmuring nervously about the tenant who had stayed late into the night, looking spooked, sweating, avoiding questions. Their words unsettled Walter, but only sharpened his focus. He dug deeper. The sand felt older the farther he went, colder, denser, as though it hadn't seen light or air in years. Another clang, this time different. Hollow, metallic. Walter uncovered a massive metal panel flush with the floor, a hatch, bolted. Painted to match the concrete, hidden beneath hundreds of pounds of sand. He sat back, breath hitching. This was no ordinary storage unit. This was a vault someone built by hand. A tomb of secrets. Walter rested his hand on the cold metal, a tremor running through him. He didn't know what lay beneath that hatch. He didn't know why someone had buried it. He didn't know what story he was stepping into. But for the first time in years, he felt unmistakably alive. He stood, wiped sweat from his brow, and lowered the unit door for the night. Tomorrow he'd come back. Tomorrow he'd dig deeper. Tomorrow he'd open that hatch. And whatever waited inside, his life had already begun to shift. Walter woke before his alarm, blinking into the pale gray light bleeding through the curtains. For a moment, he didn't remember why his chest felt tight and his legs already heavy, as if his body knew what was coming before his mind caught up. Then the image came back in a rush. The wall of sand, the metallic clang of the shovel, the flat, flush outline of a hidden hatch under the floor. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the old house breathe. The usual silence was there, but something underneath it had changed. It wasn't just another empty day waiting to be filled. There was a place he needed to be. A mystery that belonged to him now, whether he had asked for it or not. After a quick shower and a faster breakfast, he grabbed his heavier shovel from the shed, dug out his worn work gloves, and tossed a small tool bag into the truck. He added a flashlight, a simple pry bar, and a bottle of water almost as an afterthought. Old habits surfaced without asking permission. Go prepared, even when you don't yet know what you're walking into. The drive to Westline self-storage felt shorter than it had any right to. The morning air still held a trace of night's coolness, and the sky was a thin blue, stretching itself awake. As he pulled into the parking lot, the place looked utterly ordinary again. Rows of doors, sun on metal, no trace of the buzzing crowd that had gathered for the auction the day before. If someone had told him yesterday morning that this nondescript grid of units would light a fuse under his life, he would have laughed. Inside the office, Paula glanced up from her computer and gave him a curious smile. "Back early, Walter," she said. "B7 again." He heard the question behind the question. "Are you really going to dig through all that sand?" He just nodded. "Clock's ticking on the 48 hours, she reminded gently. "You know the policy." "I know." He signed the electronic log and headed out down the corridor. Each step toward B7 echoed off the concrete and metal, sounding louder than it should have. When he rolled the door up, the familiar golden mass greeted him, but not the untouched wall he'd first seen yesterday. Now there were trenches carved into it, ledges hacked out, piles of displaced sand forming miniature dunes off to one side. And at the center of it all, exposed like a secret that had blinked in the light for the first time in years, the metal hatch lay half uncovered, dulled gray and stubborn. He climbed into the unit, the sand shifting just enough under his boots to remind him how much work remained. The air inside still felt cooler, as if the buried weight swallowed heat and sound. Walter took a breath and began widening the trench he'd started, cutting a clear channel from the entrance down toward the hatch so he wouldn't be trapped in a hole if the sand shifted unexpectedly. Shovel after shovel, he carved space. Sweat trickled down his back, soaking into the collar of his shirt. Fine dust hung in the air, catching the light in a hazy curtain with every movement. The mound refused to collapse easily. Instead, it yielded with slow reluctance, like something that had grown comfortable in its concealment. He cleared one side of the hatch completely, then turned his attention toward the rear wall. There, his shovel struck something solid again. Not a flat ring this time, but a jarring, compact thud. He dropped to his knees and brushed sand away with his hands until another corner emerged. A heavy metal box, about the size of a carry-on suitcase, half sunk into the hardened layers. Grunting with the effort, he worked it free and dragged it toward firmer ground. The box was thick-sided, with recessed handles and two latches that bore the scars of old attempts to pry them open. It reminded him of secure transfer chests he'd seen used for evidence or cash transport. The locks, however, were intact. "Of course," he muttered under his breath. He set it aside for later. First the hatch. Always secure the access, then the contents. As he dug along the opposite side, the shovel scraped against glass. He winced at the sound and slowed down, flattening the blade and easing it away. Carefully, he brushed sand back until a rectangular display case appeared. The glass was cloudy but unbroken, the edges taped and sealed. Inside, even through the blur, he could see neat rows of small objects, old badges from agencies he didn't recognize, a line of foreign coins, a pocket watch, something like a medal or ribbon. No sane person buried a museum case for fun. He lifted it carefully, carried it toward the front, and set it near the doorway, out of the path of his digging. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't a junk pile. It was a layered defense. Whoever did this believed in distraction, in hiding valuables behind curiosities, valuables behind sand, and beneath it all, something else entirely. He pressed on, his back starting to complain, his arms heavy. Somewhere in the mess between the hatch and the back wall, he unearthed a small ammo can, empty but lined with cut foam, the kind used to cradle expensive or fragile gear. He found a plastic tub with folded tarps and coiled rope, sealed meticulously in plastic. Every item whispered preparation, contingency, escape. By the time he cleared the last fringe of sand from the edges of the hatch, it was almost midday. The full outline of the metal panel finally revealed itself, rectangular, flush with the concrete, bolted into place and painted over to match the surrounding floor. On one side, a recessed handle waited, half clogged with fine sand. Next to it, half hidden and grimy, sat a keyhole. "Well," Walter murmured, "that's something." He sat back on his heels and wiped sweat from his brow, eyes scanning the scattered artifacts he'd placed near the front of the unit. Among them was a small ring of keys he'd fished out earlier from between layers of sand and debris, more out of habit than hope. Most looked mismatched, an old house key, something from a padlock, a tiny brass key from who knew what. He picked up the ring and weighed it in his hand. Then he knelt and tried the first, a long, thin key that rattled uselessly inside the hatch lock. The second wouldn't even slide in. The third, smaller and worn at the edges, slid in with unsettling ease. For a heartbeat he held his breath, then turned it. The lock clicked. The sound was quiet, but it echoed in his chest, like a gunshot in a closed room. He took his time pulling the key back out, then wrapped both hands around the recessed handle. The metal protested as he strained, stuck at first, then giving way in a slow, grinding arc. Dust and a faint gust of cooler air rose from the widening gap. When the hatch finally opened fully, it revealed a dark rectangle cut into the floor, with a narrow ladder bolted into the concrete wall leading down into shadow. This was the point where a cautious man closed the lid, walked away, and called someone else. Walter stared into the darkness, felt that familiar tension coil in his gut, the same coil he remembered from doors with unknown threats behind them. Only this time, there was no partner at his back, no dispatch listening in. Just an old man in a storage unit with no one expecting him home at a particular time. He tested the ladder with his boot, then put his weight on it. The metal held firm. With the flashlight clamped in one hand and the other gripping the side rail, he descended slowly, one rung at a time. The air grew cooler as he went down, tinged with the dry smell of paper and dust and metal that hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. His boots touched concrete with a hollow echo. He swept the beam of the flashlight around him. The chamber was small, no more than 8 feet wide, and maybe 10 deep, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand without ducking. The walls were bare concrete, unpainted, without doors or other exits. Along the back wall stood 3 shapes, a wooden chest with reinforced corners, a low metal lockbox, and a pair of heavy-duty plastic cases stacked neatly. He started with the chest. The latch wasn't locked, just fastened with a metal clasp. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped it up and lifted the lid. Inside, under a folded canvas cloth, lay stacks of currency banded with bank straps, compressed into tight, solid blocks. The straps were stamped with dates ranging from decades ago to only a handful of years back. The bills on top were $100 notes, crisp despite their age. For a long moment, Walter simply knelt there, staring. His brain tried to calculate out of reflex, adding loose figures. He scanned the bundles. The numbers climbed fast, too fast. This wasn't a stash of emergency grocery money. This was the kind of money people faked their deaths over. The kind of money that vanished with people who didn't want to be found again. Beneath the cash, tucked into small felt-lined boxes, were pieces of jewelry, a diamond bracelet, a gold watch, rings with stones that glittered even in the narrow beam of his flashlight. Not extravagant enough to scream billionaire, but carefully chosen, carefully preserved assets. Portable value. His throat felt dry. For a man who counted his pension checks twice a month just to reassure himself, the sight was dizzying. He closed the lid gently and moved to the low metal box. This one was locked. He tried the key ring again. The smallest key turned smoothly. Inside, under a padded lining, lay documents. Folders, envelopes, and certificates. Old bond papers with heavy embossed seals. Stock certificates from companies whose names he recognized faintly from business headlines. Some long ago absorbed into bigger corporations. Most were issued to names he didn't know. But one surname sent a spark through his memory. A man who'd once appeared in a stack of case files from a neighboring county, a specialist in white-collar schemes who skipped town before trial and was never seen again. Not a murderer, not a trafficker. Just someone who understood numbers and loopholes and how to slide through cracks in the system. The plastic cases held more of the same. Ledgers, notes in tight handwriting. A few old photographs. A man who matched the faded, wanted bulletin in Walter's memory, standing in front of a house with a woman and two small children, smiling like any ordinary neighbor. For all his training, for all the years he'd spent dividing the world into clean lines of right and wrong, Walter felt the ground tilt slightly. The story here wasn't simple. This wasn't blood money from scenes he'd once walked through. It was something messier. A man who cheated, ran, prepared. A man who, for reasons unknown, never came back. When he climbed back up the ladder, his legs ached and his mind buzzed. He left the hatch open just enough to grab the edges if he needed access again, then sat on the sand-cut ledge for a long moment. The unit looked different now. Not like a bizarre accident with sand, but like a deliberately buried chapter of someone's life. On the drive home, the weight of what he'd seen pressed against him harder than any patrol vest had. The money, the jewelry, the papers that could likely be traced or redeemed or both. His hands belonged to a man who knew the law well enough to see it from both sides. On one hand, he had a receipt from a legal auction. On the other, he knew, in his bones, that large sums of hidden cash almost never came from clean stories. He didn't call anyone that night. Instead, at his kitchen table, he spread a legal pad in front of him and started writing, listing what he'd found, estimating, calculating, wrestling with the way his life might change if he chose one path over another. The clock ticked on the wall, indifferent. The refrigerator hummed. The world outside his windows remained ordinary, but his world no longer was. He slept badly. The next morning, he returned to Westline, the decision still unresolved, but his need to check on B7 stronger than his desire to avoid it. The lot was nearly empty when he arrived. Paula gave him a nod from behind the desk. He barely registered it. His mind was already several doors down. As he walked the corridor, a faint sense of wrongness tugged at him. Something he couldn't name yet, but felt in his skin. When he reached B7 and slid his padlock free, his fingers tightened involuntarily. He rolled up the door. The unit looked almost exactly as he had left it, ditch cut through the sand, hatch edge barely visible, crates and boxes set aside. Almost. What stopped him cold were the footprints. A faint trail of impressions marked the disturbed sand near the entrance shallow ovals, the pattern of tread just visible. They led several steps into the unit, then faded where the floor became firmer, and his own tracks from previous work overlapped. He hadn't left prints like that yesterday. Someone else had been inside. He crouched, heart thudding, and touched one of the deeper impressions. The sand gave slightly under his fingers. Not rock hard, not freshly poured, but recently disturbed. The footprint was larger than his granddaughter's, smaller than his own. A man's boot, maybe, or a sturdy shoe. Someone who stepped in, paused, then retreated. His gaze swept the unit in rapid, practiced arcs. No crates were moved, no new scuffs around the hatch, no sign that anyone had opened the hidden chamber or even reached it. If they'd found the money, they wouldn't have left it. He straightened slowly, forcing his breathing into steady, measured pulls. Eyes scanning, he stepped forward, and something small and bright caught the edge of his vision on the sand near the entrance. He knelt again and brushed aside a light veil of grit. There, half buried but unmistakable, lay a coin. A foreign coin, worn smooth at the edges, its face design just barely readable. He recognized it from the display case he had dug out earlier. One just like it had been sealed under cloudy glass, alongside the other foreign pieces. That case was still taped shut, untouched. This coin did not fall out. Someone had brought it in, someone who knew exactly what was hidden here. Someone who wanted him to see that they knew. Walter turned the coin over in his fingers. It was cool against his skin, out of place in a way that made the hair on his neck rise. A message, without words. A marker. A reminder. You are not alone in this. He closed his hand around it, feeling the edges press into his palm. The old instincts he thought had dulled with time snapped back into sharp focus. Whoever owned this unit before hadn't just vanished into thin air. And if they were gone, someone else had inherited their interest. Now that person knew about him too. He looked around the unit one more time, at the trenches, the crates, the half-exposed hatch. This was no longer just about buried money and forgotten documents. He wasn't just the man who stumbled into a stranger's secret. He was now part of it. Walter didn't go back into the hatch that afternoon. Instead, he drove straight home with the coin in his pocket and a tight knot in his chest, the kind that came from knowing you were no longer the only one in on a secret. He locked the door behind him, set his keys on the counter, and stood in the middle of his small living room for a few long seconds, listening to the hush of the house. Then he moved. The first thing he did was clear space. The old coffee table went against the wall. The rug got rolled up and tucked behind the couch. He dragged 2 folding tables in from the garage and covered them with clean sheets, turning the plain room into something that felt uncomfortably familiar, a makeshift evidence processing area. He hadn't stood over tables like these since his last days at the station, but his body remembered what to do without being asked. He brought the containers in one by one from the truck. The cash stayed hidden for now, locked in a small fireproof safe he'd bought years ago and never had a real reason to use. What went onto the tables were the things that told stories, the display case with the badges and coins, the documents, the photographs, the oddities that had turned up between layers of sand. He laid them out methodically. Jewelry in one section, watches, bracelets, rings, all tagged with small sticky notes. Paper in another, bond certificates, stock certificates, property deeds, each one smoothed flat and sorted into piles. The plastic cases emptied of ledgers and notebooks went along the back edge, ready to be opened and read when he was sure he could think clearly. Only then did he take the coin from his pocket and set it down in the center of the nearest table. It looked small there, almost innocent. But it was the only object in the room that hadn't come out of the hatch or the sand. It had come from someone else's pocket, from someone who'd been close enough to stand in the mouth of B7 and look at the work he'd done. He took a breath and forced himself to step back. "What do you know?" he asked himself silently, the way he once had in interview rooms, staring at suspects across scratched metal tables. "What can you prove?" He knew this much. The tenant who'd rented B7 had gone to great lengths to hide a significant amount of money and value. The pattern of items, the arrangement, the layered decoys, all pointed to someone with patience and a talent for staying off the radar. Someone who didn't just stash cash in walls and hope for the best. He knew the man's name now. It appeared on several older documents and on the earliest stock certificates. Daniel Harlow. The moment Walter had seen the surname down in the hatch, a half-buried memory had climbed out after it. An old case file from a neighboring county, a warrant that had sat quietly in the system for years without resolution. Harlow wasn't a violent predator. He'd been a white-collar operator. Pension skims, fake investment schemes, shell companies that folded overnight. The kind of man who could sit across from you in a restaurant and make you believe every careful lie he told. The kind who vanished before trial and left nothing but angry victims and a handful of frustrated detectives behind. Walter pulled one of the photos closer. There he was, younger than in the grainy bulletin he remembered, standing beside a woman in a simple dress, one arm around a boy, the other around a girl. They were in front of a plain house with a crooked porch step. Nothing in the image suggested a man who built secret bunkers under storage units. It suggested a man who grilled on weekends and worried about bills like everyone else. The disconnect sat uneasily in Walter's chest. He worked through the paperwork for hours, his handwriting filling page after page of the yellow legal pad as he cataloged what he'd found. Bond values, company names, issue dates, anything that might later prove important, to him or to someone else. He wasn't sure yet which. When his eyes started to blur, he forced himself to stop and look at the clock. Early evening had slipped in without him noticing. The house felt tighter somehow, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. The question returned, heavier this time. What are you going to do with this? The badge he'd carried for decades had been surrendered years ago. The code that came with it, though, had never left. You find something, you turn it in, you let the machinery of the system grind through it. That's how he'd lived. That's how he'd expected to die. But this wasn't a seizure on a warrant. It was the contents of a delinquent unit, bought at public auction, handed over with a legal receipt that said, in plain terms, it's yours now. He reached for the phone more than once, thumb hovering over contacts he hadn't called in months. Old colleagues, detectives who'd remember Harlow's name and ask exactly the questions he'd been asking himself. Each time he stopped, not out of greed, but out of something more complicated, something like the quiet certainty that if he handed this over, the story would be taken from him. Folded into case numbers and reports, locked up and forgotten again. The man who buried it was gone. The law had long ago shrugged and moved on, but someone else had been in B7. That fact shifted things into a different light. This wasn't just about what was right in theory. It was about what might happen in practice if he suddenly announced to the world that he had unearthed the ghost of a long-dead scammer's fortune. He went to bed late, sleep shallow and thin. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. Every passing car made him want to stand at the window and watch the street. In the morning, he decided to act not recklessly, not hastily, but on the piece of the puzzle he could handle without inviting chaos. He needed to know what this collection was worth. Not just the cash, but the jewelry, the coins, the papers. And he needed someone who could help him convert those things into usable reality without asking too many loose-ended questions. Downtown, in a brick building that had escaped several waves of gentrification by sheer stubbornness, he found what he was looking for. The sign over the door was small and brass, the kind that didn't advertise so much as quietly exist for those who already knew. He remembered the older name attached to it from a burglary case years back. Now a second name was etched beneath it, newer, but from the same family. Inside, the shop smelled of old wood, metal polish, and dust. Display cases held watches and pins and slices of history priced for people who appreciated history. A man in his 30s with his father's cautious eyes greeted Walter with a professional nod. Walter didn't tell him everything. He told him enough. He'd acquired the items from a legally purchased storage unit, he explained. The previous tenant was gone. The unit had been sold under standard procedure. He produced the receipt as he spoke, placing it on the counter like a shield. Then, piece by carefully chosen piece, he laid out a portion of what he'd found. Some of the jewelry, a curated selection of coins, a few of the more interesting certificates, nothing that would tip his entire hand. The appraiser listened without interrupting, then set to work. They moved from lamp to lamp, from case to table, examining engravings under magnifying lenses and checking serial numbers against reference guides. The younger man called an older associate out from the back when he encountered something especially unusual, and together they murmured over the items in low, steady tones. Time stretched. Walter sat on a worn leather chair that reminded him of interview rooms and waiting areas and the inside of unmarked cars, and watched strangers weigh pieces of someone else's long gamble. When they finally finished, the younger man gathered his notes and looked at Walter with a measured expression. "If your unit held more like this," he said carefully, "you're sitting on a significant collection." He walked him through it, how certain watches might fetch more at specialized auctions, how some of the jewelry would benefit from cleaning and proper staging, how a few of the bonds still carried redeemable value plus accrued interest. Several of the coins, he explained, were far rarer than they initially appeared, and some of the stock certificates had likely rolled over through company mergers into positions that still technically existed, waiting to be claimed by whoever could prove legal ownership. "Which, in this case," the man said, tapping the receipt, "is you." The numbers they wrote on the estimate sheet weren't outrageous movie lottery numbers, but they were big enough to make Walter's breath catch as he read them. Big enough to change the way his future looked when he thought past next month's bills. The consultant's proposal was simple. Consign the collection through their firm. They'd handle cleaning, authentication, and marketing through the right channels. Some items would go to public auction, others to private collectors. They'd assist with the paperwork required to redeem the bonds. In return, they'd take a cut. All above board, all clean. "Would there be any complications?" Walter asked quietly. Given the original owner. The man's mouth tightened in a thin, understanding line. "Given how long it's been, given that the unit was legally sold, and you didn't coerce or mislead anyone? No. The storage facility closed that chapter when they auctioned it. The rest is just unclaimed property changing hands." He said it with the tone of someone who'd had this conversation before, in one form or another. Walter sat with it for a long moment. The coin in his pocket felt heavier than its size allowed. He signed. Back home, the next weeks unfolded like chapters in a different life. Some days he drove back to the shop, delivering more items to be cataloged and prepared. Other days he stayed home, going through the ledgers and notebooks he hadn't yet fully read, tracing Harlow's trail through numbers and names. He found hints of accounts that had been closed in a hurry. mentions of partners whose full identities were never committed to paper, references to meetings that never happened or happened somewhere other than where they were supposed to. The ghost of Daniel Harlow walked through every line of ink. The first auction took place in a small hall with more folding chairs than people. Walter sat in the back, jacket zipped up, trying his best to look like just another curious onlooker. It felt surreal watching a diamond bracelet he'd unearthed from a hidden chest appear under bright lights, skimming across the room on a velvet tray. To everyone else, it was jewelry. To him, it was a piece of somebody's escape plan. The auctioneer's rhythm rose and fell, prices climbing, paddles flicking up and down. The bracelet sold for more than expected. A watch went for less. A small group of badges, once sealed behind cloudy glass, sparked a brief bidding war between two collectors who both claimed to have connections to the defunct agency stamped on their faces. Money hit his account in waves, never all at once. Each transfer came with a detailed breakdown from the consultant, who spoke in calm, practical terms about markets and timing and best possible returns. There was nothing flashy about the process, no windfall moment, just steady accumulation. Walter found that he preferred it that way. It left him room to think. When the balance in his account finally passed a threshold he'd never expected to see, with his own name on it, he didn't celebrate with a trip or a new car. He drove instead to a quiet, tree-lined street on the edge of town where a house had been sitting on the market so long that agents apologized for showing it. The Craftsman bungalow's paint was tired and peeling. The porch rail sagged. The yard looked like it had given up on being a yard and settled for being a wild gathering of weeds. But under the neglect, Walter saw bone structure. Solid beams. A deep porch that could hold chairs and laughter. Light that fell just so through the front windows. He walked through the rooms, past cracked plaster and old fixtures, and felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with money. He made an offer. It was accepted faster than he expected. The renovation became his new routine, his hands-on answer to the emptiness that had stalked him for years. He stripped old carpet to reveal scarred hardwood underneath and spent hours sanding it back to life. He patched holes in walls, learning the balance between repair and overcorrection. He replaced ancient light switches with modern ones and marveled at how small changes shifted the entire feel of a room. Neighbors, curious at first, began to wave more often. Some stopped by with unsolicited advice or stories about the previous owners. A retired electrician from down the street insisted on checking the wiring before you light this place up like a bonfire. A teenager offered to mow the jungle of a lawn in exchange for learning how to fix a sagging section of fence instead of replacing it. Slowly, the house responded. The porch straightened under new rails. The floors glowed. The walls stopped looking like they were waiting to crumble and started looking like they were ready to hold new photographs. But with the sense of forward motion came something else. A steady, low thrum of watchfulness at the edge of his awareness. The first time he noticed the car, he told himself it was nothing. A dark sedan parked across from the storage facility's entrance one afternoon while he loaded empty containers into his truck. The driver didn't get out. The windows were tinted just enough to make the face inside impossible to see clearly. When Walter pulled out of the lot, the sedan stayed where it was. When he checked the mirror 2 blocks later, it wasn't behind him. Coincidence. The second time, he was less sure. Leaving the office one day after signing a few more consignment documents, he spotted what looked like the same car idling a little further down the street. Again, no one got out. Again, it didn't follow when he drove away. Maybe he was seeing patterns where there were none. He'd spent a lifetime doing exactly that on purpose. It was hard to turn off. A week later, Paula mentioned, almost offhand, that a man had come by the storage facility asking about the auction records. Wanted to know who bought B7, she said, frowning. Said he was interested in the unit contents for personal reasons. I told him we can't give out that information. Policy, you know. She shrugged. He didn't argue, just thanked me and left. But something about him felt off. What do you mean, off? Walter asked, keeping his tone neutral. She thought for a moment. Like he was trying too hard to look casual. Wrong kind of shoes for someone claiming he worked in construction. That sort of thing. His stomach tightened. That night he walked the perimeter of his new house as the sun went down, pretending to inspect the progress he'd made on the exterior. He checked the side gate, the back fence, the shed door. Everything was as he'd left it. Almost. Near the side entrance, in a patch of dirt that hadn't been trampled much yet, he found a single clear footprint. Bigger than his granddaughter's, smaller than his own. The tread was different from his work boots. Someone had stepped there recently, then stepped back. There was nothing broken, nothing taken, no graffiti or vandalism, just the mark, a presence, a quiet hello from someone who preferred not to knock on the front door. He felt the urge to call the department rise again like a tide. Instead, he went inside, locked the door, and stood very still in the kitchen as the refrigerator hummed and the water heater clicked. You're not a cop anymore, he reminded himself. You're a man who dug up another man's insurance policy and decided to make something out of it. On the third day after that discovery, he opened his mailbox and found a plain white envelope with no return address. His name and the house number were written in neat, unremarkable print. He took it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. There was no letter inside, no threat, no explanation, only a single coin. Foreign, worn smooth around the edges. Identical to the one he had found in the sand. Identical to the ones that had once sat, sealed, in the glass display case buried under hundreds of pounds of sand and time. He held it in his palm, feeling the metal grow warm against his skin. Somewhere out there, the ghost of Daniel Harlow's past had a living shadow. Someone who knew about B7. Someone who knew about him. Someone patient enough to leave messages instead of making moves. For the first time since he lifted the hatch in B7, Walter understood something he'd been avoiding. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The envelope stayed on Walter's table for a long time after he removed the coin from it. He left it there deliberately, the way detectives leave something unsettling in view so they can't convince themselves it was imagined. Every time he passed through the kitchen, the blank paper pulled at him like a small gravity, reminding him that he wasn't the only one looking back into the past. By the second night, sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling the same truth. Someone had traced him. Someone had been close enough to his house to slip a message into his mailbox. And someone wanted him to know they were watching, not hiding. That meant confidence, patience, and intention. The combination sharpened his instincts rather than overwhelming them. He woke before dawn, brewed strong coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his legal pad and every folder from the Harlow stash he hadn't yet sorted. If this stranger wanted something, they wanted something tied to Harlow's past. Walter needed to understand that past better than the pursuer did. He started with the notebook's tight scrawls of numerical codes, transaction dates, initials he didn't recognize. Harlow had been meticulous, but not honest. Walter sifted through pages until patterns emerged. Money moved in circles, partners shortchanged, accounts opened under false names, then abruptly drained. The trail showed someone who'd grown increasingly paranoid as his schemes expanded. Near the end of the ledger, the handwriting changed, shakier, faster, as though the writer was rushing to get everything down before he disappeared. Then he found a page with a list titled, simply, People Who Know Too Much. 9 names, 5 crossed out with heavy lines, 2 marked with question marks, 1 name circled twice. Walter's pulse tightened. He recognized that circled name from an old bulletin. A man who'd been accused of assisting Harlow with moving funds overseas before vanishing around the same time Harlow did. No arrests, no sightings, just rumor that he hadn't been content with his share of the profits, that he'd been searching for Harlow long after the rest of the world had given up. A man like that wouldn't give up on a vault hidden under a mountain of sand. Walter set the notebook down, the page burning itself into his thoughts. This wasn't random. The footsteps at the storage unit, the sedan, the coin, all of it pointed to someone connected to that name. Someone determined not to lose what they believed was theirs. And now that Walter had redeemed bonds, sold jewelry, and accessed documents, there was more at stake for them than before. He stood, stretched the ache out of his shoulders, and stared at the coin again. If this shadow wanted to intimidate him, they miscalculated. What they'd done instead was remind Walter of who he used to be. He moved through the house with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years, checking locks, reinforcing weak points, placing a wedge under the back door. He wasn't preparing for a firefight. He was doing what any man with common sense and a target on his back would do, buying time. He gathered all the documents he'd cataloged, every ledger, every certificate, every picture, and placed them into 2 separate boxes. One he sealed and hid in a place no stranger would find quickly. The other he set near the front door, ready to go. Then he took out his old portable scanner and, page by slow page, began creating digital copies of everything: insurance against destruction, leverage if things went wrong, clarity for investigators if the story ever had to pass out of his hands. It took hours. By the end, the sun was high, and Walter's patience had worn thin. But he wasn't done yet. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, the direct line of a detective he trusted, a man he wished he'd stayed closer to. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Walter hung up. Leaving a message felt sloppy. He would handle this face-to-face when he needed to. It still wasn't time. Now he needed answers from the only source he could confront directly, the people connected to Harlow. He spent the next 2 days tracking down individuals tied to Harlow's past, using public records, old directories, and scraps of information in the ledgers. He found a sister in a retirement home 2 states over who remembered Daniel as brilliant, elusive, always chasing something big. Another name led him to a former co-worker who told him that Harlow grew paranoid near the end, convinced someone inside his own circle would ruin him. Then Walter found the lead he needed. A brief note in the ledger, cryptic but clear. Meeting canceled. C doesn't trust me. Disappearing tonight. If he comes after me, make sure this gets to the right place. The vault stays sealed. C. The circled name in the notebook started with C. Walter's understanding crystallized in a single sharp line. The man watching him wasn't just anyone. He was the last remaining piece of Harlow's story. Still hunting, still bitter, still convinced the cash Walter uncovered belonged to him by inheritance of old betrayal. And if the man was bold enough to approach the storage facility and leave marks near Walter's house, then eventually he'd try something direct. Walter braced for it. He didn't have to wait long. 3 nights after the envelope arrived, as he sat reading at his kitchen table in the dim glow of a single lamp, headlights washed across his window. A car rolled to a slow stop outside, same shape, same dark silhouette he'd seen twice before. Walter rose and turned off the lamp, letting the darkness pull him into invisibility. A knock came at the door. Firm, not frantic. A man expecting to be greeted. Walter inhaled deeply, let old muscle memory settle over him, and opened the door just enough to look out. A lean man in his late 50s stood on the porch, wearing a jacket too clean for physical labor and shoes too expensive for someone who claimed anonymity. His eyes were too sharp. Walter had seen those eyes in interrogation rooms, calculating, measuring risk. "Mr. Briggs," the man said with a practiced half-smile, "we need to talk." Walter didn't step aside. "About what?" "About something you found recently." The man's gaze flickered, almost impatient. "Something that belongs to me." There it was, the confirmation Walter expected, the arrogance of a man who'd spent decades believing the world owed him what he lost. "And if I don't know what you're referring to?" Walter asked. The man's smile twitched. "Then you're wasting both our time." Walter let silence stretch, not moving, not inviting. The man's eyes hardened. "Daniel Harlow was a thief. He stole from me. What he hid was mine to claim. And now you've opened a door that never should have been opened." Walter noted the phrasing, the possessiveness, the anger beneath the veneer. "You've been watching me," Walter said calmly, "ensuring you didn't misinterpret your custodial role." Custodial role. The arrogance made Walter's jaw tighten. "The unit was legally sold at auction," Walter said. "Abandoned, unpaid, contents transferred to me under state law." "State law doesn't apply to what was taken from me." "Last I checked," Walter replied evenly. "The law still applies to everyone." The man's eyes flashed with irritation. "Don't play the moral hero. You think because you used to wear a badge, you're entitled to pass judgment. You and I both know you're sitting on something dangerous, something valuable, and you can't handle either." Walter didn't rise to the provocation. He simply studied the man the way he once studied unstable suspects. Cataloging posture, tone, the twitch of a jaw, the tightening of a fist. "You're not getting anything from me tonight," Walter said. "Whatever you lost decades ago isn't my responsibility." The man took a slow step forward, testing the line of the doorway. Walter didn't flinch, but he did shift his weight in a way that made the message clear. After a long moment, the man exhaled sharply. "This isn't over. Men like me don't forget what's theirs." "And men like me," Walter said quietly, "don't scare easily." The man stepped back, eyes narrowed. Then he turned and walked to his car, pausing only once to glance over his shoulder, as if memorizing the shape of Walter's doorway. When the engine faded into the night, Walter locked the door with a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't feel triumph. He felt confirmation that the man was exactly as dangerous as he'd suspected, but not reckless. Not yet. He waited until morning, then drove to the police station. He didn't tell them everything, not the entire chronology, not every detail, but he brought them enough: copies of the documents, the page with the circled name, a full account of the man's visit and threats. He filed a report. Then he signed the formal statement that passed those materials into official hands, watching the detective's expression shift from mild curiosity to sharp concern. "That's enough to open an investigation," the detective said. "We'll handle it from here." Walter nodded, knowing he had finally placed the story where it needed to go. 2 days later, the man was arrested on an unrelated charge after officers found him surveilling another address tied to Harlow's past. And when his home was searched, they found notebooks echoing the same names, the same obsessions, the same desperation that had fueled him for years. The case tied neatly to the materials Walter submitted. The department promised to notify him as the process moved forward. That evening, sitting on the freshly repaired porch of his new house, Walter watched sunset colors spill across the street, warming the rebuilt railings and the polished wood beneath his feet. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. He held the second coin in his hand, the one that hadn't come from the vault. It felt lighter now, not harmless, not forgotten, just finished. The story that had begun with a wall of sand in a dusty storage unit had finally settled. The danger was contained. The past returned to its proper place. Walter leaned back, letting the fading light settle on his face. Some secrets bury themselves to be forgotten. Others wait for the right hands to uncover them. And sometimes, uncovering them doesn't just change a man's future. It gives him one. And that's how an ordinary man who bought a strange storage unit for $50 was pulled into a mystery buried beneath a mountain of sand. Would you dare to open a hatch like that? Let me know in the comments. I read them all. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video if the story grabbed you. More hidden secrets are waiting to be uncovered.